Well, enjoyed the study of Daniel with you. I suppose probably could have made a case for taking an extra month to really chew on that some more, but too late to plan that. If any of you wanted to study some of those later chapters in particular, I would certainly be happy to get together. Especially if you say there's coffee involved. We can meet and have a cup of coffee or whatever and try and study through that. Or if, on the other hand, you've had quite enough of Daniel for now and it's weighing heavily on your brain, I get that too. But I thought I would just offer that. Beginning with some housekeeping here, there's a study guide packet, same spot I've been putting the other material. This includes the class schedule and study guides for the first 5 sessions. It's going to largely go roughly a chapter a week, not quite, but you'll see that schedule in there. This will take us, of course, December through February. And if you're tired of looking at me on Wednesday night, I have some good news for you. Tyler Burwitz is going to partner with me and teach some of these sessions. So excited about that. Also wanted to mention, Jacob has graciously agreed to allow us to use his daily devotionals this year for 2 Corinthians. Of course, we've been reading about, the title of our reading has been A Year in the Letters of Paul. That compilation was just published. You didn't ask me to give that plug. I'm just throwing that out there anyway. But he has graciously allowed us to use those devotionals for 2 Corinthians. If anyone would like a printed copy of this, I can get that to you. You just need to let me know. I decided against mass producing a bunch of these because it's bulky. It's 35, 40 pages or whatever. Really good stuff. Whether you've been through it already or not this year as part of the daily Bible reading, a lot of really good insights for this. Every devotional has one thing to think about, one thing to pray for, which I think is helpful because as we're going deep in the Word, we need to be praying the Word. And this is a very good tool to supplement your study. We'll also try to, Jacob mentioned we could put this on the website, so we'll try to do that as well. I think I know how to do that. Okay, I think that's all of the housekeeping I wanted to do. Let's get right into talking, for lack of a better term, some background info. We're not starting 1 Corinthians tonight. We're starting 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians seems to be, it's kind of like the forgotten child sometimes, right? We study 1 Corinthians. We're I don't know, maybe I'm overgeneralizing. We seem to be a lot more familiar with 1 Corinthians than 2. Maybe that's not the case for you. And so you'll have a lot to contribute in this class. But let's just remind ourselves of, maybe, in the back, not able to advance this. You'll get us squared away. The gospel in Corinth, about AD 51. There we go. Thank you. I'm going to just put this up here. Okay, it's still not advancing. Wait a minute. User error. It works. Yeah. It was magic, Tyler. You got within 3 feet of me and it started working. Okay, Paul's first visit to Corinth. Acts chapter 18 relates that to us, where Paul would spend a total of about 18 months there in Achaia, specifically in Corinth, preaching, persecution involved. We're introduced to some other workers like Apollos and Priscilla and Aquila. We know that Timothy did some work there, Silas. Some believe that Peter may have gone to Corinth based upon language from 1 Corinthians, I believe in chapter 1 and also 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So Paul's first visit to Corinth. There seems to be a lot of interaction he had that we can only speculate about. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he talks about writing to you in his letter. Well, that's what we know of as 1 Corinthians when he talks about this letter that he has written. Clearly, it predates 1 Corinthians, but we don't know where it's at. It's called the Lost Letter. Some refer to it as simply Corinthians A. So we're going to have a different convention here. We're going to go A, B, C, and there's actually a D, possibly. So 1 Corinthians 5, at some point, when, couldn't tell you, there was this lost letter. Well, of course, Paul would write 1 Corinthians, I believe, from Ephesus in AD 53, 54. That one we obviously know all about. Later on, though, and we'll see references to this, Paul makes a visit described as painful. That's referenced in 3 times in 2 Corinthians. He also makes mention in 2 Corinthians of a severe letter. Could this be, in fact, I would just, would both of these be referring maybe to the same thing? This is, if this was a separate letter, this would be Corinthians C. The point being, Paul had a lot of correspondence with this church. Paul was concerned about this church. Paul was prayerful for this church. Paul didn't give up on this church. Would you have? Corinthian church had a lot of problems, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. At some point, Paul sends Titus to Corinth, as we see in this letter that we're about to study. We don't read about that until later in 2 Corinthians chapter 7. He just really wants to know how they're doing, okay? And so there's all of this correspondence, and then at some point he can't stand it anymore. His spirit has no rest. He sends Titus to Corinth. Now, they're supposed to meet up, I think maybe in Troas. I'd have to go look in chapter 7. I'm blanking out. It ends up not being able to meet Titus where they originally planned to meet. Well, then Titus returns with this glowing report, this wonderful report. Not all is well, as 2 Corinthians makes obvious, but overall, some very positive things happening. And so based on that joyous report, Paul writes 2 Corinthians. So I just want us to see this letter that we're about to study. I pushed the wrong button, didn't I? Is all the way down here, but there's been all of this preaching and teaching and follow-up and emotion and praying. Paul is vested in this church. And I think that's important to point out because as we read 2 Corinthians, it is a very intimate letter. It is a very personal letter. We learn much, maybe as much as in any letter of Paul, some biographical information about him, about his journey as a believer. And he opens his heart up to these people like perhaps he doesn't with any other letter. That makes sense in light of this history that he has with them. And then in 2 Corinthians 12 and 13, he essentially proposes a third visit. He will say, this is the third time I am coming to you. What did that happen during the 3-month stay in Greece in Acts 20? Not certain, but we know that Paul wrote the book of Romans from the city of Corinth. So these brethren were never far from his mind, okay? The point of this is not to go through every fine point and remember all of these dates. The overall point for going through this is to emphasize Paul's care and concern for these Christians. Okay, so then why did Paul write 2 Corinthians? We've touched on that, haven't we? Why did Paul write 2 Corinthians? Well, to affirm his love for them. In fact, in chapter 2, he will affirm them, he will urge them to reaffirm their love for one another. In particular, someone, it looks like fellowship has been withdrawn from them, and we'll have that discussion about that. But he writes to affirm his love for them, to praise them, to express his joy over their progress in the faith, here's an exercise for you. Go through 1st and 2nd Corinthians and write down all of the glowing things, the positive things he has to say about them and to them. And then you look at that and you think, man, if I didn't know these were written to the Corinthians, it's kind of surprising. But knowing Paul, not really. He's not given up on them. Again, I ask us, would we have? It was a challenging work, to be sure. He's going to defend his ministry and apostleship. We'll talk about the reason for that here in another exercise coming up. But in 2 Corinthians, in fact, the first 7 chapters are a defense of his ministry. And then in chapters 10 through 13, there's a very impassioned, vigorous defense of his apostleship. But he also wants to, and this may be what he really wanted to get to, but he had to do all of this other defending of his ministry. He wants to call them to follow through on their intent to gather funds for needy believers in Judea. And so as we outline the book, I've mentioned chapters 1 through 7. He's defending his decisions as the minister of the gospel. Chapter 5 as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. Chapters 8 and 9, he's going to call for the completion of collecting funds for needy saints. And then in chapters 10 through 13, again, a vigorous defense of his apostleship. Comments or questions or other insights about that? We have a couple of mics here. We'll pause, and if somebody has a comment, we'd certainly be glad to hear that. Okay. Well, so I want to go through this exercise with you, because I found this fascinating. I found this instructive. We're going to get, tonight, God willing, we're going to look at the first 11 verses of chapter 1. That's all we're planning to get to, and then we'll pick up the pace a little bit more next week and try to make it largely through chapter 2. Again, if you pick up one of these, you'll have the schedule and know what to prepare. Okay, so I want to talk about this in terms of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Okay? Now, in the business world, this is actually an exercise that companies go through to kind of set the stage for strategic planning. But I think it would be useful and instructive for us. Let me make sure this is muted. To go through this with regard to the Corinthian church. Let's start with strength, because we may have a harder time populating this list, perhaps. We know what the problems are at Corinth. I want you to tell me, and if you have a lengthier comment, ask for the microphone, raise your hand, but just rapid fire. What are some of the strengths, the things you see as a strength of the Corinthian church? Things they had going for them. Okay, we've got a comment right here, and then one back there. Go ahead, Rachel.
They were willing to listen to Paul's critique of them.
That's no small thing. A willingness to have hard things said to them. Some really tough things said to them, and they were willing to engage. In fact, they were willing to give it back to Paul in the form of hard questions. So they weren't afraid of tough conversations, tough talk. Steve Walton.
They really, deep down, they had humble hearts, because when they were confronted, especially with the brother who was who was sleeping with his father's wife, they took the matter and took care of that. in a loving way, the way Paul wanted them to do it. They did it exactly that way, and that brother was restored.
They should not have been tolerant, but at least they were teachable. That's a good point. We have a comment up here. Okay, go ahead. Somebody's got, oh, go ahead. Oh, Kyle's got to get the mic right here.
Well, I just look at all the adjectives that he assigns in the first chapter to them. You are standing firm. Tears, joint tears in the second chapter.
Okay. Is this in 2 Corinthians?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The first chapter, standing firm's in the 23rd verse of the first chapter. And
Yep.
many tears in verse 4 of the second chapter.
Yeah. So they have a very strong relationship with Paul.
Well, they'd come through the rebuke
Yeah.
to this point that he could say this
Yeah.
about them.
Yeah.
And his ascribing that to them is genuine.
Yeah. Well, and they've spent many of them have spent 18 months with Paul. And then when you read through Acts 18, that was far from a cakewalk.
Well, this
Dragging an official through the streets, it was a very tough time to be a Christian there in Corinth.
these at least the first two chapters are full of these kinds of things, joint prayers, those kinds of things that showed their strength.
Exactly.
They had learned that from Paul, but they had carried forward in his.
That's a really good point. Chapter 1 and verse 11, you also joining and helping us through your prayers. That doesn't sound like a hypothetical, does it? Sounds like he was confident that, and he knew they were praying for him. Would you pray for somebody that had been really straight with you and said some things that make you squirm? Or would you think, forget him, he's getting his, you know? Very loving congregation had the capacity for that. Okay, what other strengths do you see in this church? Drew? They had a ton of miraculous spiritual gifts, a wide diversity, a wide range of spiritual gifts. Chapters 12 and 14 of 1 Corinthians make that clear. So this was a church that the Spirit had equipped in that way abundantly. And we know those gifts were given for a purpose. They had every intention of using them. Now, their execution was a little lacking, okay? They got a little bit all over the place and worship became chaotic, but the desire was there to use the gifts. They just needed to fix some of the thinking between their ears so that the use of that would be what God intended. But God certainly has blessed them. So you could either put that as a strength or even as an opportunity, or maybe both. That's true. You could put it as a weakness because of their abuse of it. You could put it as a threat in case, if they don't listen to Paul's writing, then it becomes a threat. So it could go in all four. That's probably the case for some of these others. Okay, what else would you classify as a strength of the Corinthian church? Any other thoughts? The goal here is not to get every drop of blood from the turnip that we can, but to kind of flesh this out in a way that helps us just get a fuller picture of this church and why Paul would care so much about her. Chapter 3 of 2 Corinthians. You are our letter written in our hearts. And we think, well, which church was Paul's letter? Well, I'd probably pick the Philippians, right? My joy and my crown. You, Corinthians, are our letter. Really, Paul? That's what you want, you're putting them out there as a token of your workmanship in Christ? Yeah, that's a really good point. What else do you see? Okay, say that again. I want everybody to hear that. Go ahead.
He commends them for having the ability to know and to understand, to be able to read, to know, and to understand.
Okay. And the willingness and ability to understand, to be discerning, and most of all, to make application, regardless of where that took them. Back to Rachel's point. Very good. Yeah. Children of God. That's always a plus. Yeah. Well, tell me about the church there in terms of who they used to be. What? 1 Corinthians 6. That's where I was hoping somebody would go. Remember, such were some of you? I think that was the first sermon I preached here. No, it wasn't really the first. Maybe October. I've lost track. Such were some of you, and you start reading through that and getting a sense of the way they used to live. The gospel has had a dramatic impact. This church is full of people with changed lives. You don't have to convince them is the gospel powerful. You don't have to convince them if the gospel is worth it. They have been washed, they have been justified, they have been sanctified in the name of Christ. Very good. In which you stand. Outstanding. I'd forgotten about that. 1 Corinthians 15, the opening verses there. So, yeah. So, here are just some of the things that, okay, we've lost that up there. Here were some of the things that I had. Again, the idea is not to develop an exhaustive or exhausting list. Changed lives, diverse membership, faith that has been tested in a pagan culture. Now, they don't always pass the test, but their faith has been tested. It was being tested. As was mentioned, a variety of spiritual gifts, willingness to ask hard questions, evangelistic. I mean, where did these converts come from in 1 Corinthians 6? Are we to believe that was all Paul's work? I don't think it was. Very enthusiastic, very passionate. Now, yes, sometimes misguided, but this church had a lot to commend and to commend to us today for all of her problems. Okay, so then, in the category of weaknesses, I'm just going to rehearse a few things because I'm going to trust we're very familiar with what some of those are. So, for instance, this mentality of self-centeredness. That's really at the core. I mean, a lot of what we're looking at in 1 Corinthians are symptoms. Taking one another to court, that's a symptom. The underlying cause is self-centeredness and the focus on my rights. So that mentality of pride, self-centeredness, they're very carnal, some of them, very fleshly in their thinking. Someone mentioned tolerant of immorality when they should not have been. There's a divisive spirit among them. Maybe the word for that is sectarian spirit among them. Worship at times is chaotic. And in terms of theology, they need some instruction, right? You kind of get the sense that in 1 Corinthians 15, this is what he wants to talk. He has to talk about all this other stuff before he can get to 1 Corinthians 15. What's the subject of 1 Corinthians 15? The resurrection. And they need to kind of get some things straight about that. They've been listening to some voices about, that's the chapter in which it says, do not be deceived, evil companions, finish that. Corrupt good morals. That's a context talking about their belief in the resurrection. Okay, what about in the area of opportunities? What opportunities did this church have before her? The opportunity to aid, to help brethren who were struggling financially due to famine, drought, what have you. And not just any brethren, but Jewish brethren. And think of the opportunity there for fostering a spirit of unity among Jews and Gentiles. So this was no small open door for them. And Paul, for various reasons, wants them to follow through on that, for all of the good that can come from that. That would be a great opportunity. We've alluded to some others. Scott?
Well, I was just going to say the opportunity for continued growth in the Lord, because I think,
Yep.
you've been talking about would we give up on that church? I mean, did Paul give up on the church? Why did Paul not give up on the church? But you've mentioned the environment that these people came from. One of the things we're too quick is we think somebody's baptized them, they should have it all right. It takes a good amount of time and growth, and I think that's why you see Paul's not giving up on them. It's going to take me a lot of time to mold them and kind of teach them the ways of the Lord, and he's continuing doing that. So that's the thing I was thinking about, opportunity to just continued growth in the Lord to become more like what they're supposed to be.
Great point. And you think about this, I know the chapter divisions were not inspired, but 11 of 13 chapters are spent defending his apostleship. You think at some point it's like, folks, I'm an apostle. You need to get that. And why go to such great pains? This probably wasn't the first time to devote that much space. Now, it's a question of how much energy do you want to continue to put in this church? And Scott, to your point, we know the answer to that. Paul sees the potential here. He sees the open door. We'll go ahead and add this to the list. Corinth was very accessible by land and by sea. Would encourage you to, if you haven't done any study of that, to dig into some reasons why that was so. You had a lot of people coming through the city due to the Isthmian Games. Of course, the shrine to Aphrodite, no doubt, brought lots of people in. So there are all of these lost people that need to be taught. And so Paul is vested in helping this church continue to be strengthened, because the stakes could not be higher. What other opportunities do you see for the Corinthian church? Yeah, Tyler.
Overall, it's a maturation of every facet in their lives. He talks about reaffirming their love, executing on their eagerness to give, examining themselves. So he's hitting on kind of both an inward, introspection of where they need to be, but also their outward, giving and the opportunity to give. So it is the whole opportunity is you need to take it to the next level.
Absolutely right.
You've done well up to this point after a lot of ups and downs.
Yeah.
There's still much further to go.
Well, that's a really good point, Tyler. He's moving them to a greater maturity by pushing them to do things that mature Christians do. The giving. I mean, it's a mark of spiritual maturity that when you've been through a conflict, to come back and reaffirm your love for the person that you've been in severe conflict with. That's what mature Christians do. And he is moving them to maturity. I think that's a great insight. Paul is not just treading water here with them. He's moving them forward. Really good thought. Yeah, Kyle?
In the 11th chapter, one of the things that he talks to, I'm concerned for you with godly jealousy.
Okay.
Jealous for you with a godly jealousy. And then he tells them,
Chapter 11, you said?
yes, chapter 11,
Yeah.
first 2 or 3 verses. But he said there was one thing he was afraid about. that they couldn't give in to false teachers. And he says, but I am afraid that your minds will be
Yeah.
led astray from the simplicity and purity of the devotion in Christ. So although they
Yeah.
had been strong and had overcome a lot of things and had learned the things that work, like prayer and working together, nevertheless, there were false teachers about, and he warns them of that and says he's afraid. I'm afraid that you might actually follow some false teachers. So
Good point.
in a city like
Yeah.
Corinth and then Cenchrea, which was a sister city and full of a lot more people, the kinds of things that had brought them down as a church in the beginning when Paul met them are still there, but they still have to use the tools that they have been
Yeah.
given, that they have learned,
Yep.
prayer and working together.
Exactly. Okay, so we'll catch up here on our slide. Here are some opportunities that I see. City greatly accessible, very wealthy city. What could disciples do with that wealth? That represents opportunity. Lots of lost people to be taught, a chance to strengthen bonds of unity, the door to serving the Judean brethren, the opportunity to resolve hard issues, and to develop capable shepherd leaders. I mean, if you need shepherd leaders in any church, you need them in this one, right? And who's going to answer the call? That's an opportunity. And then, as we've touched on, some of the threats, of course, there's the ongoing pagan influences of idolatry, immorality, worldliness. But now new influences in the church clearly have challenged Paul's credentials and his authority. So he might have, someone might have been tempted to think, this is like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Paul's still hanging with them. He's writing, he's grinding, he's hanging with them and urging them to hang with the Lord. Okay, so anyway, I hope that helped you to think about it through that lens of these 4 categories. But I think it's just helpful to have these things in mind before we launch into the letter. So let's think now about the first 11 verses with the last few minutes that we have here. Let's go ahead and read these together. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 1 through 11. It says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the church of God, which is at Corinth, with all the saints who are throughout Achaia, grace to you and peace from God, our Father, and the Lord Jesus Christ. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For just as the sufferings of Christ are ours in abundance, so also our comfort is abundant through Christ. But if we are afflicted, it is for your comfort and salvation. Or if we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which is effective in the patient enduring of the same sufferings which we also suffer. And our hope for you is firmly grounded, knowing that, as you are sharers of our sufferings, so also you are sharers of our comfort. For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction, which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death, and will deliver us, he on whom we have set our hope. And he will yet deliver us, you also joining in helping us through your prayers, so that thanks may be given by many persons on our behalf for the favor bestowed on us through the prayers of many. Now, that can be a little bit cumbersome to try to read. I find it helpful to just slow down. You can get your, as D. Bowman would say, your tang tungled real quickly here. Give me some of the prominent words in this text. Comfort. It's comfort, 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 comfort. You could make a compilation video of that. I didn't count the number of times. Clearly, he has comfort on his mind. He wants to talk about the God of all comfort. What other language do you see? Sufferings. And you can't have one without the other, because the comfort comes from God in our sufferings. So there is suffering, there is affliction, there is comfort. Okay. So, in verses 1 and 2, there's a lot of emphasis on God in these verses. Paul is an apostle, not of his own volition, but by the will of God. These Christians are the church of God. He's noting identity. He's noting ownership. He is citing the basis upon which they have unity with one another. They are the church of God, which is at Corinth. And then grace and peace comes from who? That's his standard greeting, I know, but in this context, can you see how Paul would be using this language to unify them and to restore their confidence in his apostolic credentials? Okay, so that's how he begins the letter. Then in verses 3 through 7, we have all of this language of comfort and affliction. Paul notes that our God is a God of mercy and a God of comfort. But one of the things that we see in this text is that God clearly has purposes for our affliction that may or may not match up with what we think God's purpose should be for our affliction. Or maybe another way of saying it, the role of suffering in our lives. Sometimes God has a different view of what that should and will be. Notice that Paul does not seek comfort through the removal of affliction. Rather, he is trusting in God to provide comfort in affliction. God is the Father of mercies. If there are no afflictions, no need for mercy, and God of all comfort. His mercy and his comfort work in concert. He comforts us in our affliction, and we see that God has purpose for that. What's his purpose? Well, one of the ends that God wants to use our suffering for is to equip us. By having comforted us, he thus equips us to be able to do what? To comfort others. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, and in citing this example, I say this delicately. But for example, those who have lost an adult child or a younger child will forever speak and know the unspoken language that other parents who are faced with that speak. See, I can't even say it right. There is an eloquence that those of you that I've just described, and I've seen it. I've seen a couple. I've never forget Joe. He's 30 years old. Gets sepsis, and boom, he's gone. Start my first work in Indiana. Devastating. But I'll tell you what, Dick and Jan, God used that. And all they had to do was walk into a funeral parlor. And not a word had to be said. Not saying it was good that Joe died. I'm saying that God uses that for good. I think that's an example plenty of other examples. So that's what Paul is talking about. God uses Paul's comfort to comfort them. Paul will use their comfort to comfort others. It's kind of a case of paying it forward. Verse 5, as the sufferings of Christ are ours, so also our comfort is abundant. We will only be comforted to the extent that the sufferings magnify the comfort. Does that make sense? The sufferings serve to magnify the comfort. So God provides comfort. In fact, later on, he will talk about deliverance. What kind of deliverance? It's interesting to read in Philippians, 2 Timothy, this passage, how Paul speaks of deliverance. I'll tell you, Paul often didn't think of deliverance as rescue from the trial. In fact, in 2 Timothy, he talks confidently about being delivered, knowing that he was about to be executed for his faith. And yet he's saying, God's going to deliver me. There are greater things to be delivered from than death. And that was Paul's mindset. And it's very challenging for us. But this is a chapter that really stretches our thinking on that. If we are afflicted, Paul is looking at this as, what can God do with it? God can use it to comfort others, even to save others. God can use comfort to help people endure similar sufferings. Paul would say in verse 7, our hope for you is firmly grounded. God is using Paul's affliction to help them. And then Paul opens up about his affliction. He's very, I think Jacob in his daily devotionals used the word vulnerable, which I appreciated. He was willing to be vulnerable. Go read that one. I think that was verses either 1 through 7 or 8 through 14. I can't remember. But he was vulnerable. He opens his heart to these brethren in a way that he perhaps doesn't in any other letter. But in that, he is leading them to greater confidence in God. As he is confident in God to deliver, he wants them to embrace the pain. He wants them to entrust themselves to a faithful Creator and to trust God the way that he did. And he could only teach them that. You can teach things by sermon, you can teach things by letter, and sometimes you just have to teach things by example. And that's what Paul is doing with this church. That's why he's sticking with them. And he's going to show them in the way that he's handling these accusations how a Christian endures suffering. And so this letter is really valuable to the faith of this church, these brethren. Final thoughts? How?
The word comfort, I'm amazed how many times we run into the Greek word that translates paraklesis here.
Paraclesis?
Paraclete is what Jesus promised to the apostles, that when he said, I will send the comforter to you, the helper. You used the term a while ago that this is what God is doing. But our aid and help comes from the apostles' aid and help came from the comforter.
Yeah.
But I'm of the opinion that our comfort comes from God, and
Sure.
it's just like what Jesus promised.
Yeah.
It's something we ought always remember. Paraclete.
Yeah.
It's a profound word.
Oh, God comforts his people through his promises, through his people. He comforts us in a number of different ways, but all of it's from God. Agreed. Okay. Saved by the bell, or by the tone. Pick up a packet, and again, if you want to